Alright, we are in chapter 12 of the book. One more chapter after this. Alright, let's get into it. They all stood staring at the man on the floor. Jessica took an involuntary step backward. Charlie was glued to the spot. She could not look away from him. Because I am one of them, as if he could tell what she was thinking. John stepped up beside her. Charlie, he's insane, he said quietly, and it was enough to break her away from the dreadful, ecstatic gaze. She turned to John. We have to get out, she said. He nodded, turned back to the group, and gestured to the walkie-talkie in his hands. I'm going back to the control room, he said. These things are police radios. There has to be a way to get them to reach the outside. Maybe I can use the equipment in there to get a signal somehow. John, you are so retarded. I doubt you can even turn on the radio. But go ahead, I guess. I'll go with you, Charlie said instantly, but he shook his head. You have to stay with them, or else there can be no more plot development, he said, barely audible. Charlie looked over at Jessica and Carlton. He was right. Charlie needed someone with him. And Jessica was holding it together, but she couldn't be left alone in charge of the safety of both of them. Charlie nodded. Be careful, she said. He didn't answer. Instead, he tucked the walkie-talkie into his belt, gave her a wink, and laughed. Oh my gosh. So cringe. OMG. That's a juicy whopper. Clay Burke was in his office reviewing this week's case files. There was not much traffic violations, 2 petty thefts, and 1 confession to the murder of Abraham Lincoln. Clay shuffled through the papers and sighed, shaking his head. He pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and removed the file that had been plaguing him all morning, Freddy's. When he closed his eyes, he was there again. The cheerful family restaurant, its floors streaked with blood after Michael disappeared. He had worked 14-hour days, sometimes sleeping in the station. Every time he came home, he went to look at Carlton, who was usually asleep. He wanted to grab his son and hold him close, never let him go. It could have been any of his children there that day. It was blind, dumb luck that the killer had spared his own. I wouldn't say that. But, okay. At the time, it was the first murder the department had dealt with. It was a 16-person department, usually charged with small thefts and noise complaints, and to be handed a gruesome murder made all of them feel a little like kids whose toy guns had suddenly turned real. Clay opened the file, knowing what he would find. It was only a partial record. The rest was in a storage room in the basement. He scanned the familiar words, the bureaucratic language that tried but failed to obscure the point. There had been no justice done. Sometimes the guilty get away with terrible things, and it was the price we pay, he said to Charlie. He cringed a little now, realizing how that must have sounded to her of all people. He picked up the phone, calling the front desk in a moment of urgency rather than walking the 20 feet to ask in person. Has Dunn reported back from Freddy's, he asked before the officer on the other end could speak. No, sir, she said. He hung up, not waiting for her to finish. Clay stared restlessly at the wall for a long moment, then grabbed his coffee cup and headed to the basement. He didn't have to search for the box of evidence from the Freddy disappearance. He had been here before. There was no one around, and so instead of taking it upstairs to his office, Clay sat down on the concrete floor spreading papers and photographs around him. There were interviews, witness statements, and reports from the on-scene officers, Clay included. He sifted through them aimlessly. He didn't know what he was looking for. There was nothing new here. There was nothing to find, really. They knew who did it. At first, he had suspected Henry, just like so many others around the town. It was a terrible thought, but it was a terrible crime. There was no solution that would not be shocking. He could not have been the one to answer Charlie, to question Charlie's father. But he had read the transcript. The man had been almost incoherent, so shaken that he could not give straight answers. He sounded as if he were lying, and to most people that was proof enough. But Clay had resisted, had delayed having him arrested, and sure enough they came to William Afton, Henry's partner. Afton seemed like the normal one in the venture. The businessman. Henry was the artist. He always seemed to be off in another world, some part of his mind thinking about his mechanical creatures, even when he was holding a conversation about the weather or the kids' soccer games. There was something off about Henry, something almost shell-shocked. It seemed like a miracle that he could have produced a child as apparently normal as Charlie. Clay remembered when Henry had moved to town and begun construction on the new restaurant. Someone had told him that Henry had a kid who had always been abducted several years prior. But he didn't know much else. He seemed like a nice enough guy, though he was obviously terribly alone. His grief visible even at a distance. Then Freddy Fazbear's opened and the town came alive. That was also when Charlie appeared. Clay hadn't known Henry, even had a daughter, until that day. William Afton was the one who made Freddy's a business, as he had the previous restaurant. Afton was as robust and lively as Henry, was withdrawn and shadowy. He was a hefty man who had the ruddy geniality of a financially shrewd Santa Claus, and he had killed the children. Clay knew it. The whole department knew it. He had been present for each abduction, and he had mysteriously and briefly vanished at the same time as each child went missing. A search of his house found a room crammed with boxes of mechanical parts and a musty yellow rabbit suit, as well as stacks of journals full of raving paranoia and pornography. Passages about Henry that ranged from wild jealousy to near worship. But there had been no evidence, there had been no bodies, and so there could be no charge. William Afton had left town, and there was nothing to stop him. They did not even know where he had gone. Clay picked up a picture from the pile. It had been taken framed from the wall of Henry's office at the restaurant. It was a picture of the two of them together. Henry and William grinning into the camera in front of the newly opened Freddy Fazbear's. He stared at it. He had stared at it before. Henry's eyes did not quite match his smile. The expression looked forced, but then it always did. There was nothing unusual here except that one of the men had turned out to be a killer. Suddenly Clay felt the shock of recognition, something indistinct he could not quite catch. He closed his eyes, letting his mind wander like a dog off the lead. Go on, find it. There was something about William, something familiar, something recent. Clay's eyes snapped open. He shoved everything back into the evidence box, cramming it into messily. Keeping out only the photograph, clutching it, he took the stairs up 2 at a time, almost running by the time he got to the main floor of the station. He headed straight for a particular filing cabinet, ignoring the greetings of his startled officers. He tore open the drawer, pawing through it until there it was, employee background checks requested by businesses from the last 6 months. He pulled out the stack and flipped through it, looking for photos in the third folder. He found it. He picked up the picture and held it next to one of Henry and William, turning so his body did not block the light. It's him. The background check application was labeled Dave Miller, but it was unmistakably William Afton. Afton had been fat and affable. The man in the picture was shallow and thin, his skin sagging and his expression unpleasant, as if he had forgotten how to smile. He looked like a poor facsimile of himself, or maybe Clay thought he looked like he had dropped his disguise. Clay flipped the page back to see why the check had been requested, and his face drained white. His breathing stopped for a moment. Clay stood, grabbing his jacket in the same motion, then stopped. Slowly he sat leaning, letting the jacket fall from his fingers. He took the partial file back out of his drawer, and delicately he lifted one of the photos out. It had been taken in the aftermath when the place was no more than a crime scene. He paused for a moment, and closing his eyes, he looked again at the picture, willing himself to see it for the first time. There was a glimmer of light he had never seen before. One of the animatronics on the stage, the bear, Freddy, was looking toward the cameraman, one of his eyes illuminated with a smear of light. Clay put the picture aside, moving to the next one. This one was from a different angle, but the side of the main stage was still in the frame. Chica's body was facing away from the camera, but her face was turned directly toward it, and another smear of light streaked across her left eye. Clay rubbed it with the tip of his finger, making sure it wasn't a defect in the paper. The next photo showed Bonnie in the darkness behind the chairs. A pinpoint of light like a star shone from one of his eyes, as though reflecting a spotlight that wasn't there. What is this? Clay could feel his face flush. He realized he hadn't been breathing. He shuffled his hands on the desk like a conjurer calling forth a picture to reveal itself. One did. The last picture he had taken in Pirates Cove. Tables had been disturbed, he remembered. The scene was chaotic, the tables and chairs in disarray, cluttered, strewn through the halls. But unlike so many other times he had stared at this picture, he ignored the disorder and focused only on the stage. The curtain was pulled back slightly, a figure barely visible in the recesses behind it, one eye presumably illuminated by the flash of a camera. Clay studied the rest of the pictures, looking for more reflections, but found none. There was no flash. Jason appeared to have opened his eyes. His leg hurt. It was steady, dull pain. He flexed it tentatively and found he could not move easily. The injury could not be too bad. He was lying on something lumpy, and his whole body felt stiff, like he had been asleep on a pile of... He looked at what he was lying on, a pile of extension cords and wires. He sat up. It was dark, but he could dimly see what was around him. He bent over to examine his leg. His jeans were ripped where Foxy's claw had gouged him, and the gash on his leg was ugly, but it filled with the wires and extension cords. And he got nanomachines, and he was finally able to beat up on the boss of Metal Gear Solid Revengeance, Senator Armstrong. Armstrong. And, wait, I'm sorry. I got a call from Hudson. I paused and I lost my place. I was talking about Armstrong in the Chills voice. And he was facing Armstrong, Senator Armstrong, final boss of Metal Gear Revengeance. And he teamed up with Jack the Ripper and killed Senator Armstrong, the best football captain of Texas at Austin. He loves college football and making scrambled eggs. But the hook had mostly got hold of his jeans. Jason felt a little relief. Satisfied, he began to examine his surroundings. He was in a corner, and there was a heavy black curtain strung from one wall to the other, cutting the space off from the room outside. He crawled forward over the cables cautiously, careful to make no sound. He made his way to the edge of the curtain where there was a tiny silver sliver of a gap between it and the wall. Jason took a moment to steel himself, then peeked out, conscious of every movement. Now, he was on the small stage in Pirate Cove. Behind the curtain, he could hear something moving out there. Something large, but from his position, he could see only an empty room. He pushed his head out a little further, craning his neck to look. He couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, but with every sound, he grew bolder, readying himself to leap out from the stage and run, just like Foxy. A light was pushing in the main dining room, illuminating the hall for brief seconds at a time with bright, busy carnival lights. It wasn't much, but it gave Johnson a direction to run. He watched it intently until all he could see, and then it stopped. The room was dark, darker than it had been before. His eyes adjusted to the light. Now he was nearly blind. The shuffling around went on, and Jason pulled the curtain open further. This time he moved too fast, and the curtain was drawn. The metal rings held it clinked together. The light above Pirate Cove went on. Foxy was there, right in front of him. His face was so close to Jason that he could almost touch it. Jason scrambled back. Though the curtain, pulling it close together again, trying to escape the small alcove, but there was nowhere to run. He crawled backward, staying against the wall, hoping that the curtain would somehow shield him from Foxy. At once the curtain began to open, not by force, but as if a show were about to begin. Lights and color flashed in silent patterns, and the glitter from the curtains rolled back in grand fashion to reveal the stage, with the beast standing patiently at its base. Foxy cocked his head to the side as if considering something, and then it began to approach him. He climbed the stairs to the stage one by one, each step a whole series of disjointed movements, as if each piece of his metal body maneuvered itself individually. Johnson waited, struck with horror, yet some small part of him was enthralled. It was like nothing he had ever seen. Foxy reached the stage and took two more large, deliberate steps, till he was standing over Johnson. Johnson stared up at him, too afraid to move, all frozen in place, mouse beneath a diving falcon. His breath was shallow, but his heart beat so fast his chest hurt, and I say hurt. Fox raised his hook again. Jason threw himself down on the floor on the ball, protecting his head and his balls with his arms, waiting for the blow to come. It did not, though. Johnson did not move. He waited and waited, wondering if time had slowed down as he approached the moment of his death, his mind trying to give him refuge, making the last moments feel as long as possible, but not this long. He opened his eyes, turned his head a little, keeping his arms in front of his face. Foxy was still there, not moving. Despair. Despite himself, Johnson moved the creature's eyes. It was like looking into the sun. Fox's burning silver gaze made Jason's eyes tear up, made him want to look away like the holy light of Allah. But he could not. It was not animatronic who looked away. As Jason watched, peering through the afterburn that clouded his vision, Foxy turned to face his absent audience. His hook fell slowly to the side, his head tilted forward, and he went motionless. The sounds of whirling machinery and clicking parts came to a stop, and the curtain drew closed ahead. "Ready?" Lamar said. Marla nodded quietly. "I'm ready," she said. She threw open the door, fists clenched, and they climbed out, facing opposite directions, preparing for an assault. Marla was breathing heavily, her face furious. Darkness was thick, almost tangible, and she could barely make out what was around her. She could see Lamar, but if they drifted their feet apart, they would be lost to each other. The lights above them flickered, but only for a moment. The brief illumination ruined what little light vision they had, making the dark impenetrable. "Anything on your side?" Muller whispered. Lamar looked toward her voice, distressed. "No. Anything on your side?" "Light, please," Muller whispered. Lamar held up the flashlight as though aiming a weapon and turned it on. Above them the lights sputtered. Jason could see their flashlights waving back and forth, filtering through the slight transparent curtain. Oh no! The light fell on the animatronic just for a moment, and there was a clicking sound. Jason looked up. Foxy was not moving. Light swept across him again, and above the mechanical sounds came, this time unspeakable. Though he did not move, Jason scooted forward around Fox's foot and looked up at the animatronic's face as the light struck him again. Again the clicking noise came. Something inside him was readying itself, but his eyes stayed dark. Jason crawled as far forward as he was willing to venture, trying not to cross into Fox's line of sight. He made it to the edge of the curtain, raised his arm out to wave. "Jason!" He heard his sister's voice, and then a quick searching around what could have been Lamar. Flashlight swept up, trained on the stage, and Fox's eyes lit up. His head swept toward the light with a predatory precision, and Jason panicked. Reached from the pile of cords and grabbed a cable. Foxy lifted a foot, and Jason threw the cord around it, yanked it with all his strength. Foxy pitched forward, grabbing at the curtain with his hook. He caught, ensnaring him, and he ripped through the cloth with a vicious tearing noise, falling from the ground in a triangle of cloth and metal limbs. Jason scrambled past the struggling creature and ran toward the light. Muller reached for him, but he brushed her aside. "Run," he panted, and the three of them took off down the hall. They turned a corner, and as they stopped, Jason skidding against Lamar and grabbing him for support. At the end of the dark hall stood another figure, too large to be a person. The top was unmistakable. Freddy Fazbear. His eyes were illuminated, the piercing red glow consuming the space around him. They could hear the brittle notes of a song, mechanical like the music box. We're waiting every night to finally roam in and invite newcomers to play with us. For many years we've been all alone. We're stuck in here to play the same song since we heard that day. Newcomers to play with us. For many years we've been all alone. Don't stop us away, don't put us away. We're just a soul trapped in a soul and just all control. We're waiting every night. The song continued, and coming from Freddy's direction, they stared, mesmerized, and Jason found himself and pulled at Marla's arm. "Come on," he hissed, and they followed him, running back the way they had come. And when they reached Pirate's Cove, they slowed. Foxy had thrown himself off the curtain and was beginning to right himself. The three exchanged glances. They ran past him. Jason held his breath until they were through to the next doorway, moving some old superstition. Lamar motioned to one of his party rooms, and they ducked inside. He switched on the flashlight, and they stood still for a moment, their eyes adjusting. The room had 3 long cafeteria-style tables, each one still set for a party. Metal folding chairs were lined all up and down them, and each place was set with a party hat and paper plates. A plastic cup, but wordless agreement, each hid beneath a different table, leaving themselves as much space as possible. They They crouched together low, hoping to be lost behind the chair legs, and together they stared silently they can all and listened. Well, howdy, partner. Hello, anyone? John repeated into the radio. But there was only static. He had managed to hook the walkie-talkie into the sound system, but getting a signal to the outside seemed impossible. Freddy was sealed off from the world. He looked at the monitors again. On one screen, he could see 3 figures crouched under the table. Marla, Lamar, and Jason, he thought. They have found Jason. Respect 100. He realized with profound relief, letting go of the tension he had not known to feel. Everything on screen was lit with unnatural grays and whites. And there must be night vision on cameras, he said to no one, squinting to see through the static. He watched the blurred figures crawl and come to a stop beneath a long pot of tables. Then movement from one another screen caught his eyes. There was a figure in the hallways, moving steadily forward to the room they were in. Jason could not tell what it was, but the way it moved wasn't human. It stopped beside a doorway, and with a sudden jolt of realization, John looked again at the potty room where his friends were hiding. He grabbed the walkie-talkie and flipped the speaker system on, jamming the volume control as high as it would go. "Lamar," he said calmly, trying to sound commanding. He heard the reverberation of his own voice through the walls of the control room. "Lamar, don't move." I'm going to get my lovely assistant, Ray Ayanami, to speak on the audiobook for this next paragraph. "Hi, my name's Ray Ayanami. How's it hanging?" John's voice bled over the speaker, blurred with a static but unintelligible. "Lamar, don't move." Lamar, Mother, and Jason looked at one another across the distance between the tables. The room lit up with a burning red glow, and they watched as still as that could be as Freddy Fazbear entered the room. His movements were mechanical and graceless as he walked with deliberate steps to the middle of the room and stopped between 2 tables. Marla on one side, Jason on the other. Jason looked at his sister, and she put a finger on his lips. Jason hadn't realized there was little tears on his cheek until now. All right, thank you, Ray and Ayanami. Very cool. He watched as Freddy surveyed the room. His head with eyes like spotlights, word in one side, stopped with a click, and then turned to another side. There was a long pause. The 2 padded feet were motionless. The legs like black trees in a forest. There was a sound of twisting fur and crinkling fabric, and the feet began to pivot. Freddy turned around and headed for the door, each step shaking the floor beneath him. As Freddy passed by, Jason shrank back instinctively. His foot hitting one of the metal chairs, it made a scraping sound. Jason's heart raced. Frantic, he looked across the space at Marla, who beckoned to him urgently. Freddy had stopped, but they could still hear the sound of fabric and fur scrunching and moving. Freddy began to bend down. His motions were slow in the precious few seconds. Jason pushed the 2 chairs in front of him apart, making a gap just wide enough for him to be able to crawl between Freddy as soon as he could have the chance. The light of Freddy's eyes came into view under the table, illuminating the space beside Jason, and he quickly but quietly crawled between the chairs to where Marla was hiding. Freddy stood again, training his eyes on the floor just as Jason pulled his foot out of sight. Freddy began to pivot toward the table that they were under. Marla put a hand on Jason's arm, steadying him. There was another pause. Lamar, under the table opposite them, beckoned to Marla and Jason, urging them to his own table farther away from Freddy's. Marla shook her head, not wanting to risk making noise. Maybe he's leaving, she told herself. Jason was beginning to breathe normally again. When it struck them, Freddy was ducking down again, this time silently. His eyes had gone dark, but as soon as they spotted him, his gaze lit up again, illuminating the room. Marla and Jason scrambled around the metal chairs as fast as they could, without touching them. They crawled across the thin carpet between tables until they came across an opening in the chairs and crawled under the table beside Lamar. Marla and Lamar looked at each other at a loss. Freddy was straightened up again and beginning to circle around to the third table, or, as some people know, the fourth closet. But we'll get there eventually. We have to run for the door, Marla whispered. Lamar nodded, then motioned for them to follow his lead. He watched, waiting until Freddy was bending down once again, and then gestured into the main table. They caught their breath, trying not to gasp, and Lamar looked toward the door. Could they make it? Marla put a hand on Jason's shoulder, and he started to shrug her off, but she was gripping him tightly, her fingers digging into him. He moved to brush her away, then looked at her. She was terrified, even more than he was. He let her hold on to him while keeping her eyes on Freddy, waiting for their next opening. It did not come. As they waited, poised for flight, Freddy turned away, his deliberate steps taking him to the doorway. The room went dark, and Jason's heart skipped before he understood that what had happened. The lights were gone because Freddy was gone. Wow, getting to John's deductive skills there, Jason. Good for you. Let's see, what else? What guest should we bring on this time? What about Osaka from Azumanga Daioh? That's a pretty good character. Marla, he whispered. His voice little more than a breath of air. He's gone. Marla looked at him and nodded, but she did not let him off his shoulder. Are you okay? She asked in the same almost soundless way. He nodded, then pointed to his leg and shrugged artistically. She smiled at him and looked at her hand from his shoulder to muss his hair. Suddenly, the man was tapping Marla's arm. He pointed to his ear, and she gave him a puzzled look. Jason stiffened, realizing what it was. In a second, Marla did too. There was music in the room, a tiny, labored sound like a music box. The gaps between the notes just a little too long. The room lit up again, drowning red, and before they could move, the table was rushed away. Freddy stood over them. He shoved the tables aside, almost hurling it. They screamed, not a scream for help, but the last futile act of defiance. Jason clung to his sister, and she pulled his head down against her, shielding his eyes so he would not have to see. Suddenly, Freddy stumbled off balance and lurched to the side. He tried to right himself, but another jolt from behind sent him flying forward, falling face first into the table. Marla, Lamar, and Jason looked up to see Charlie and John, their faces flushed with effort. Come on, Charlie said. Let's go. Dave shoved off the bonds quickly. The knots were sturdy, but the cords had too much give. Few twists and turns, and he was free. He crawled to the door on hands and knees and held his ear to the crack. careful not to jostle the door and give himself away. The last speaker bled, and the sound of he had been waiting for footsteps running away. He waited just until the sound faded, then got purposefully to his feet. All right, thank you, Osaka. Have a nice life in college as a school teacher in training. Bye-bye. Oh, bye-bye. I'm going to go be a big old teacher. All right, you go do that, all right? Bye. I love you. Oh, honey. Hey, don't worry about it, sweetheart. Where are we going? Marla painted as they raced back toward the main dining room. The office, Charlie called. It's got a real door we can barricade ourselves in. She glanced at John, who nodded shortly. What they would do once they were barricaded inside was another question, but they could worry about that once they were safe. They ran through the dining room. Charlie glanced at the stage, blurred in passing, but she saw what she knew she would. It was empty. They reached the narrow hall led to the office, and Charlie's heart lifted when she saw the door, light shining from its small window like a beacon. Wait, light? Question mark? She slowed her pace, where 10 feet from the door she lifted a hand, signaling the others to stop as they approached. The door slowly stealing herself. Charlie grabbed the knob and turned. It was locked. She looked helplessly at the others. Someone's in there, Jason whispered, moving closer to Marla. There's no one else here, Marla said softly, but it sounded like a question. Charlie was about to try the door again, but stopped herself. Don't draw their attention, or else you'll get dead. He got loose, Jessica said, voice hoarse, and Charlie felt a chill. No, I'm a good Girl Scout. I know I did those knots right. But she didn't say it. We have to go back, she said. Without waiting for a response, she turned, pushing between Lamar and John to take the lead. She took 2 steps forward and 1 step back, then stopped dead as she heard the others gasp. It was Chica! Her eyes like burning orange headlights. She stood at the other end of a short hall, blocking their only way out. Her body filled the space because of this sheer girth. They could not even try to run past her. Charlie glanced behind her, even though she knew there was no way out. Before she could react, John was running at the animatronic. He had no weapons, but he hurled himself toward the thing and leaped up, trying to grab hold of her neck. He caught it briefly, struggling to hold as Chica thrashed her head back and forth. Chica bent forward and swung to the side, slamming John into the wall, and John let go, crumbling to the floor. The cupcake on Chica's platter snapped its mouth as if laughing, its eyes rolling in their tiny sockets. John, Charlie cried, as she thrust the flashlight back for someone else to take. She felt its weight leave her hands, but she didn't look back to see who took it. She looked up. There was an electrical cord dangling above their heads. Parts of the rubber had worn away, exposing the stretches of bare wire. Chica was slowly advancing. Charlie jumped up, but she could not get high enough to reach it. Oopsie. She looked to either side. Is it narrow enough? She glanced at Chica. She was moving slowly with measured steps. They were trapped, and she did not need to hurry. Charlie planted one foot against the wall, then stretched her leg across the narrow hallway and did the same on the other side, bracing between the walls to climb. She inched upward, but her legs shaking with the effort, she looked up, struggling to retain her balance. As she reached for the cord, careful to touch only the rubber, she closed her fingers around it and dropped it to the ground. Chica lunged forward, her arms extended and her teeth contorted in a mechanical smile. Charlie sprang up to the electrical cord brandished in front of her, and she shoved it into the space between Chica's head and her torso. Chica jerked backwards, sparks flying, and for a horrible moment Charlie could not move. Her hands throbbed with the electrical current, and she was caught there, unable to make her hands let go of the wire. She stared down at it, willing her fingers to open. Is this how I die? Lamar grabbed her and pulled her away, because he was scared of her not going to an afterlife, and she looked up at him, wide-eyed, and she said, "How dare you touch me?" The others were already running. Chica was deactivated, or so it appeared, slumped forward, her eyes dark. Lamar gave her arm a tug, and they took off after the others. Without a pleased smile, Dave watched the confrontation through the window in the office door. Just a matter of time now, he thought. The girl had been clever, climbing through the walls like that, but she had almost killed herself. They could not last much longer. All he had to do was wait. Suddenly the room was lit with an ethereal blue. He froze, then suddenly turned. Bonnie! The animatronic towered over him, close enough to touch. Dave fell back against the door and screamed. Eh! There was a scream from the direction of the office. The group paused for a minute and looked nervously at one another. It doesn't matter, Charlie said. Come on. She took a quick look back at Chica, who was still slumped forward inert. Charlie led to the main dining room. As they emerged, there was sudden movement. Foxy was there. He leaped onto a table in front of them, looking among them until his silver eyes lit on Jace. Okay, before I had been putting silver eyes just like as a joke, but this time it actually does say silver eyes. I think that's kind of funny. But yeah. He crouched as if he were about to jump on the boy, and Charlie grabbed a napkin dispenser and threw it as hard as she could. It struck Foxy's head, glancing off with little effect, but it was enough to get his attention. He turned to her and pounced. Charlie was already running, racing to lure him away from the others. Then what? She thought it as she could furiously out. She ran furiously out of the dining room and down the hall, the arcade. It was dark. There were things to hide behind. She kept running full out until she reached the door, then turned so fast she almost fell, hoping to give Foxy a moment's disorientation. She looked around frantically. There was a row of arcade machines at the back of the room, set out just a little from the wall. She heard footsteps behind her and dove for it. The space was so tight she could barely squeeze herself into it. Her sides were pressed between the consoles and the wall, and there was the thick, coiled wires beneath her feet. She took a step back, moving deeper into the crawl space, but her foot slipped on a cable and she barely kept from falling. Movement in the room caught her eye, and she saw a flash of silver light. He sees me. Charlie dropped to her hands and knees. She crawled backward, scooting inch by inch. Her foot caught on a cable, and she stopped to free it, twisting into an impossible position to quietly dislodge it. She moved back farther, and then Her foot bumped against another wall and she stopped. She was closed in on 3 sides. It almost felt safe. She closed her eyes for a moment. Nothing here is safe. There was an awful sound, a clash of metal hitting metal, and the console at the far end of the row rocked on its foundation, banging back against the wall. Foxy leaned over it, and now Charlie could see him as he smashed the display, splitting shards of plastic onto the floor. His hook caught on something inside the machine, and he yanked it out again, trailing bits of wire. He moved on to the next game, smashing the screen and throwing the console against the wall with a casual brutality. Charlie felt the impact of its echoing throughout the wall as he moved closer. I have to get out. I have to. But there was no way out. Now that she was sitting in one place, she realized that her arm was stiff with pain. And only now she looked at it. The bandage was soaked through with blood. The wall beside her was streaked with a line of it where her arm had pressed. She wanted to cry suddenly. Her whole body ached. The wound in her arm, the constant tension of the last day or so, who could tell how long it had been, was draining her, taking all she had. The next console crashed against the wall, and Charlie flinched. "Ha, you flinched." It was only 2 away. He was almost to her. She could hear his gears working, humming, grinding, and sometimes screeching. She closed her eyes, but she could still see him. His matted fur, the metal bones showing through the shearing silver eyes. The console beside her was wrenched away and tumbled to the ground like it weighed nothing at all. The cords beneath Charlie's hands and knees jerked forward with it, and she slipped, grabbing at nothing, trying to regain her balance. She caught herself and looked up just in time to see the downward swing of a hook. Oh, finally, we're done with the flashback. It took 370 pages to get to the... Oh my gosh. You know, I just wish this book would be, let's see here. The book would be, it would be, so it would be about 20 pages if there was no flashback. Instead, it ends up being 389 pages. I didn't need to know like all of this. It could be summed up in like a few words. But I guess that's my job. She moved faster than she could think. She hurled herself at the final console with all her strength, and it bounced precariously, then fell, knocking Foxy to the ground and trapping him. Charlie started to run, but his hand shot out and snarled her leg, cutting into her. She screamed, falling to the ground. She kicked at him with her other foot, but his hook was stuck deep in her leg. Every time he jerked back, she felt the impact. She kicked at him in the face, and his hook tore free, slicing open her leg. She screamed again, instinctively grabbing the wound, and then Foxy was on top of her, snapping his jaws and clawing her as he tried to free his leg from under the console. She fought back, struggling to get from under the console. She fought back, struggling to get away. His hook slashed at her again, and again she tried to block the blows, screaming for help. Suddenly John was there for some reason. He stood over Foxy and stomped down hard on the creature's neck. Holding his foot there, Foxy flailed out but could not reach him. "Charlie, get up," he called. Charlie just stared at him for a second, too shaken to register the question. He stamped his foot on Foxy's neck repeatedly, and then in one quick movement, he grabbed Charlie's hand, heaved her up, and started to run, pulling her along behind him. They made it to the main dining room, where the rest of the group was huddled. In the middle of the room, relieved, Charlie rushed to join them. She could tell she was limping, but she did not feel any pain, but she realized somewhere dimly in the back of her mind was not good. When they got to the others, her heart sank. Their faces were grim. Lamar was holding the flashlight out in front of him, but it rattled in his trembling grip. Marla gestured quickly to the entrances. Freddy stood in the hall to the storage room, while Bonnie now blocked the hallway to the office. Chica, reanimated, stood on the stage, looming over them. Charlie glared back the way they had come. Foxy was approached. He had freed himself. He stopped in the doorway as if waiting for a signal. There was no escape. Suddenly, acutely aware of everything around her, Charlie noticed the sound of a music box as she had unconsciously been hearing it all along. She took a deep breath. The moment seemed to go on forever. It had come to this. They were trapped. They waited. Now, perhaps for an animatronic, there was no hurry. Charlie cast her eyes around futilely for a weapon, but there was only party hats and paper plates. As the animatronics started their approach, Charlie grabbed the back of a metal folding chair, not sure how she could even use it. The animals were moving faster now, coming in unison as if the battle were a choreographed dance. Marla took Jason's hand and whispered something in her ear. Whatever it was, he shook his head, set his jaw, and balled his hands into fists. Lamar glanced at him for a moment, but said nothing. Jessica had her hands stiffly at her sides, and she was murmuring something to herself. Probably some girl talk about boys and all that. You know women. But go women. Y'all can be pretty cool. Unless you're not, then you're pretty stupid. Like Jeffrey's younger sister, Maria. Pooey. The animals were almost on top of them. Freddy's trundling walk was predatory. Dang, Freddy. You just gonna, let them say that about you? Alright. In the music box, the notes were coming from Freddy's direction. From inside Freddy, she now realized. Chica leaped from the stage and took small bouncing steps toward them as if excited, but holding herself back. Bonnie's big, paw-like feet slapped on the ground like a challenge. Those stinky feet. And Foxy slung forth with a malevolent gaze, his eyes fixed on Charlie as if she were the only thing he saw. She gazed into his silver... Oh my god. I know I was making the joke before, them always saying silver eyes, but never actually saying silver eyes. But now they're actually just saying silver eyes every time. It's really stupid. They filled her vision, crowding out everything else until the world was silver. The world was Foxy's eyes, and there was nothing left of her. John squeezed her hand. It broke the spell. She looked at him, her vision still cloudy. "Charlie," he said haltedly. "Charlotte?" "Shh," she said. "Later." He nodded, accepting the lie that there would be a later. Foxy crouched down again, and Charlie let go of John, her heart pounding as she braced for it. Foxy's joints shifted in their sockets as he prepared to spring. Then he stopped. Charlie waited. There was no screams from behind her, no sounds of fighting. Even the music box was silent. Foxy was motionless, though his eyes still glowed. Charlie looked around, and then she saw. Okay, I'm not reading it right now. I swear, if it's a 6 a.m. thing, that's a 10 out of 10 book right there. If it's 6 a.m. It was Freddy, not the one they all knew, not the one who stood less than a foot away from Marla, his mouth open as if poised to bite. It was the other one, the one she remembered, the yellow Freddy from the diner. The costumes were the costume her father used to wear. It was looking at them, staring from the corner, and now she heard something. It was indistinct, just whispers in her head, a gentle sorceress blowing through her conscious mind without taking hold. She looked at the others and knew they heard it too. It was indecipherable, but the meaning was unmistakable. Carlton was the only one to say it. Michael! Oh, Michael! The sounds they heard grew warm, an unspoken confirmation, and together they approached the Golden Bear. Marla brushed past Brown Freddy as if he were not there, and Charlie turned her back to Foxy unafraid. There was only one thought in her mind. Michael, it's you. They were almost to him. All Charlie wanted to do was fling her arms around him, hold him close, and to be again the little girl she was long ago. To embrace him again, this beloved child who had been ripped away from their lives. That carefree afternoon, to do it all over, and this time to rescue him, this time to save his life. Michael, she whispered. The yellow bear stood motionless, unlike the others. There seemed to be nothing inside of it. It stood on its own accord, but its own will. There was nothing to hold the costume. Jaw closed and its eyes were empty, suddenly aware that their backs were to the other animatronics. Charlie startled and turned apprehensive. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy stood at rest, almost as if they were back on their stages. Their eyes were locked on Charlie, but they had halted their approach. It's the kids, Carlton whispered. Foxy wasn't attacking Jason, Marley gasped. Foxy was trying to protect him. John took hesitant steps toward the middle of the dining room, then approached more boldly, looking at each of the robots in turn. It's the kids! Oh my... Oh, how did we not know? Oh. Oops. He echoed. All of them. Their faces were no longer animalistic, no longer lifeless, as if some spirit inhabited them. Suddenly there was a crash from the sealed exit door. They all startled, turning as the wall beside the welded entrance shook with the force of a dozen blows. Now what? Charlie thought. The bricks broke and fell scattered in pieces across the floor, dust filling the air in rusty clouds. A figure stepped through the hole, wielding a massive sledgehammer. And as the air slowly cleared, they saw who it was. Clay Burke, Carlton's father. His eyes set on Carlton, and he dropped the hammer, ran to his son, sweeping him into embrace. Clay stroked his hair, gripping him like he'd never let go. Charlie watched from a distance, relief touched by a stiletto edge of envy. Dad, I'm gonna puke, Carlton murmured. Clay laughed but leaned back when he saw that Carlton wasn't kidding. Carlton bent over, hands on his knees, fighting the urge to retch, and Clay's father took on alarm. Carlton straightened. I'm good. Clay was not listening to anyone. He was looking around the room at the animals. All of them were frozen in time, displaced. "Okay, kids," he said, his voice low and his words careful. "I think it's time for us to go. Let's head out of here." He started toward the exit he had made. They glanced at one another. The whispers were gone. Whatever he had been, the yellow Freddy was slashed again. An empty suit, though no one had seen it move. Charlie nodded toward Clay, and the rest started forward, heading almost reluctantly to the hole in the wall. Charlie hung back. John stayed beside her, but she gestured him forward, taking up the rear. She had barely had time to take a step when something took hold of her throat. Charlie tried to cry out, but her windpipe was being crushed. She was whipped around as if she weighed nothing, and she found herself face to face with the yellow rabbit. Dave's eyes were shining through the triumphant. He had his arm around her neck, squeezing her throat so tightly that she could scarcely breathe. He held her so close he was almost in an embrace. She could smell the costume, stained fur, and years of putrid sweat, blood, and cruelty. He spoke, still staring at Charlie. "You are staying, bad girl." "Almost not," Clay said, taking on the group's authority. Dave dug his fingers deeper into Charlie's neck, and she made a strangle sound. "I will kill this one right here while you watch, unless you do as I say," he said. And his voice was almost pleasant. Clay looked at him for a long moment, calculating, then nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice calm. "We'll do as you say. What do you want?" "Good," Dave said. "Riddle me this. I'm loud and obnoxious. I like music that rhymes. I'm a quarter of the population, but commit half the crimes. What am I?" Clay began to move toward them, and the others followed. He did not know what to say. He could not answer for fear of being canceled. And Charlie looked up at the man in the rabbit suit, and he met her gaze. "It was you. You killed Michael. You killed Sammy. You took them away from me." And William Afton said to her, "How'd you get that from a little riddle, Miss Lassie?" His eyes should have held something fierce and dangerous. They should have been windows to the rotten core inside, but they were only eyes, flat and empty. Charlie plunged her hands into the gap beneath the costume's head. Dave drew back, but she held on. "If you want to be one of them, then be one of them," she shouted, and she tripped the spring locks. Dave's eyes widened, and then he screamed. Charlie jerked her hands free, barely evading the locks as they snapped open and plunged into his neck. She took a step back, watching as Dave's crumbled to the ground. She's still screaming as the costume released. Part by part, the animatronic inside pierced the flesh, ripping up his organs, tearing through his body as if it were not even there. At some point he stopped screaming, but he was still writhed on the floor for what felt like long minutes before he was still. Charlie stared, breathing hard as if she had been running. The form on the ground seemed unreal. John was the first to move. He came beside her, but still staring down, she weaved him off before he could touch her. She could not bear it if he did. Jessica grasped, and they all looked up. The animatronics were moving. The group drew back, huddling together, but none of the animals were looking at them. One by one, they took hold of the broken body on the floor and began to drag it away toward the hall of Pirate Cove. As they disappeared down the hallway, Charlie noticed that the yellow Freddy was gone. "Let's go," she said quietly. Clay Burke nodded, and they filed out of the restaurant for the last time. And that's where it all ended off. Bye-bye.
Chapter 13. The sun was rising as they emerged into the open air. Clay put his arm around Carlton's shoulder, and for once, Carlton didn't brush him away with a joke. Charlie nodded absently, blinking in the light. Carlton and I are taking a drive to the ER, Clay continued. Is anyone else who needs a doctor? I miss it there. Oh.
Okay, Jeffrey.
I forgot to say there.
That's fine.
They won't care.
I mean, it's mostly us.
I'm fine, Charlie said reflexively. Jason, do you need to go to the hospital? Marla asked. No, he said. Let's see your leg, she insisted. The party stopped as Jason held his leg out for Clay to examine. Charlie felt an odd relief wash through her. A grown-up was in charge. Now, after a moment, Clay looked up at Jason with a serious face.
You don't want to read anymore?
I'll keep on going. I don't think we're going to have to cut it off, he said. Not just yet, Jason smiled, and Clay turned to Marla. I'll take care of him. Might leave a scar, but I'll just make him look tough. Marla nodded and winked at Jason, who laughed. I need to change my clothes, Charlie said. It seemed like a pretty thing to be worrying about, but her shirt and pants were wet with blood in some places, dry and stiff in others. It was beginning to itch. You're a mess, Carlton pointed out redundantly. Will she get a ticket if she drives like that? Charlie, are you sure you don't need to go to the hospital? Marla said, turning her laser-like concern on her friend now that her brother had been declared safe. I'm fine, Charlie said again. I just need to change my clothes. We'll stop in the motel. When they reached the cars, they split into what had become their habitual groups. Marla, Jason, Lamar, and Marla's car. Charlie, John, and Jessica and Charlie's. Charlie opened the door to the driver's side and stopped, looking back at the buildings. It wasn't just her out of the corner of her eye. She could see them all gazing at it. The empty mall was dark against the pink-streaked sky, long and squat, like something British and slumbering.
And slumbering. They all turned away, getting into the cars without speaking. Charlie kept her eyes on it, watching as she started her car, waiting to turn her back to it until the last possible moment. She pulled out of the lot and drove away. Along the road, the car split off, and Carlton and Clay took the other turn out of the parking lot, heading to the hospital, and Charlie turned off toward the motel while Marla continued to the Burke's house. I call for a shower, Jessica said. They got out of the car, then seeing Charlie's face. I'll make a special exception in your case. You go first. Charlie nodded in the room. She grabbed her bag and took it into the bathroom with her. Leaving John and Jessica to wait, she locked the door behind her and undressed, deliberately not looking at the gashes on her arm and leg. She didn't want to see what was there, just to clean and bandage it. She got into the shower to let out a quiet yelp as the stinging water hit her open cuts. But she gritted her teeth and cleaned herself, washing her hair over and over until it was rinsed clean. She got out and toweled herself dry, then sat down on the edge of the tub, put her face in her hands, and closed her eyes. She was not ready to go out yet, not ready to face whatever aftermath, whatever discussion there might have to be. She wanted to walk out of the bathroom and never speak again of what happened. She rubbed her temples. She didn't have a headache, but there was pressure inside there. Something that had yet to emerge. You can't stay here forever. Charlie still had the gauze and tape from the first time around. She took it from her bag, wiped both wounds clean with a hotel towel, and bounded her arm and leg, using all the gauze. I probably need stitches, she thought, but it was only an idle thought. She would not do that. She got up and went to the mirror. There was a cut across her cheek. It had stopped bleeding, but it was ugly. She didn't know how to cover it, but she didn't really want to, for the same reason she didn't want stitches. She wanted them to heal wrong, wanted them to scar. She wanted proof displayed on her body. This happened. This was real. This is what it did to me. She dressed quickly to her jeans and her last remaining clean t-shirt, and emerged from the bathroom to find Jessica and John carrying suitcases out to the car.
I figured there was no point leaving stuff here. Jessica said, we're all going in the morning. We may as well bring it all to Carlton. Charlie nodded and grabbed Jason's backpack, taking it to the car along with her own. Carlton and his father were already back by the time they arrived, and again they entered Carlton's living room. Now almost familiar, Carlton was curled up in an armchair by the fireplace where someone had lit a fire, and Marla and Lamar were on the couch. Jason sat right in the front of the fireplace, staring at the licking flames. Charlie sat down near him, arranging herself stiffly. John joined her, looking at her with concern, but she ignored him, and he said nothing. Are you okay? Charlie asked, reaching up and rubbing Carlton's arm for a moment. He looked at her sleepily. Yeah, it's a mild concussion, he said. I'll be fine as long as no one ever tries to murder me again. So now what? Jessica said, as she took the chair beside Carlton. She paused, searching for words. What happened? She said firmly. They looked at each other. It was the question they all had. What do you do after something like this? Charlie looked at Clay, who was standing in the doorway, only half in the room. Mr. Clay, what happens now? She said quietly. He looked off in the distance for a minute before answering. Well, Charlie, you are a murderer now, and I'm going to have to go back to Freddy's. But you just wait here before I can press charges on you. I have to get my officer, he said gravely. I won't go alone. He forced a smile, but no one joined him. What do you think should happen? He asked. He was looking at Charlie, asking her the impossible question as if she could answer it. She nodded, accepting responsibility. Nothing, she said. It's over. I want to leave it that way. Clay gave her a nod, his face impassive. She could not tell if it was the answer he was looking for, but it was all she had. The others were silent. Marla and Lamar were nodding, but Jessica looked like she wanted to protest. Jessica? What? Charlie said gently, realizing with unease that her friend wanted permission to disagree. It just seems wrong, she said. What about everything? People should know, right? That's how it works. The guard, he murdered all those kids, and people should know. No one will believe us, Jason said without looking up. Officer Dunn, Jessica said. Officer Dunn, he died in there. What will you tell his family? Will you tell them the truth? She looked at Clay. Officer Dunn died at the hands of the same man who killed your friends. I can prove that now. A silence fell over the room. It won't bring them back, Clay said softly, but maybe it will give them some rest. Clay turned his eyes to the fire for a few minutes past before he spoke again. You kids have been carrying Freddy's with you all these years. It's time you left it behind, he said. He was stern, but his commanding tone was reassuring. Little does he know there's so many other books. I'm going to see it that Officer Dunn is given a proper burial. He paused, collecting himself as though what he said next required effort. Your friends, too. His brow furrowed. I have a few favors to call in, but I can make this happen quietly. The last thing I want to do is disturb that place or desecrate it. Those kids need rest. The next morning they began to go their separate ways. Marla offered to drive Lamar and Jessica to the bus stop, and they said their goodbyes with hugs and promises to write. Charlie wondered if any of them meant it. Marla probably did, at least. They pulled out of the Burke's driveway. So my bus isn't till later, John said as Marla's car disappeared over a bend in the road. I wouldn't mind a few hours in Hurricane, Charlie answered. To her surprise, she realized it was true. John flashed her a quick, almost nervous smile. Okay, then, he said, let's get out of here. Let's go somewhere, anywhere. When they were alone in the car, John gave her a sideways glance. So, he said, are we ever going to see each other after this? He tried to say it lightly, but there was no way to lighten it. Charlie stared straight ahead. Maybe, she said. She could not look at him. It wasn't the answer he wanted. She knew that, but she could not give him what he wanted. What could he say by way of explanation. It's not you, it's the weight we both bear. It's too much. When you are here, I can't ignore it. But something in our thoughts felt off, not quite right, as she was speaking by rote, thinking off a script. It was like flinching instinctively to protect an injury before remembering it was healed. She finally looked at John beside her. He was staring through the windshield, his jaw set. I have somewhere I need to go, she said abruptly, then made a slow U-turn. She had never gone to visit the place, but now, without warning, her mind was consumed by it. Aunt Jean had never suggested it. Charlie had never asked. She knew where it was, though, and now she headed there. With a singular sense of purpose, I need to see. Charlie pulled to a stop in a small gravel parking lot beside a low fence of short white posts, chains swinging between them. I just need a minute, she said. John gave her a concerned look. Are you sure you want to do this now? He said softly. She did not answer, just got out of the car, closing the door behind her. The graveyard before them was almost 100 years old. There were hills of lush grass and shading trees. This corner was at the edge of the cemetery. There was a small house only a few yards past the edge of the fence. The grass was trimmed neatly, but it was patchy and yellowing. The trees had been pruned too far, so the lower branches were bare, too exposed.
There was a telephone pole set just as... Can I redo it? No. I just saw you sitting in front of me. There was a telephone pole set just inside the fence, barely on the cemetery grounds, and beside it were two headstones, plain and small. Charlie stared at it for a long moment, not moving. She tried to conjure up the right feeling, grief and loss, so that she could mourn. Instead, she just felt a numbness. The graves were there, but the sight did not touch her. She took a deep breath and started towards them. It was such a small memory, one of those moments that meant nothing at the time, just one day in a series of days, the same as the others. They were together, just the two of them, and it must have been before everything, before Fredbear's went wrong, before anyone was dead. They were sitting out back behind Fredbear's, looking out over the hills, and a crow landed and began pecking in the dirt, looking for something. There was something about its sharp, darting movements that struck her as the funniest thing she had ever seen. Charlie began to laugh, and her father looked at her. She pointed, and he turned his head, trying to see as she did, but he could not tell what she was pointing at. She could not get it across to him. She did not know the words, and just her excitement was to turn to frustration. He saw it too. Suddenly, he laughed and pointed to the crow. Charlie nodded, and he met her eyes, looking at her with an expression of pure, boundless delight, as if it would fill him to bursting. "Oh, Charlotte," he said.
All right, thank you, Hudson.
I don't get it.
I don't either. My name is Carter Phillips. I am the author of this audiobook, and I have my grievances with it. For starters, I do not like the branch off the main story to a different story where Charlie did not die by William and turn into the puppet, but instead lived on, and her father died. Also, the animatronics. Let's get into that. In the main series, they go after you because of your affiliation with William. You are his son after all. And you look very similar to him supposedly. And it's just, in this book, they just start attacking the teenagers at will, at random, for no particular reason. Which doesn't really make sense at all. Now, I don't understand William at all. He is too far gone in the book, and I guess it does go in line with the games, since it goes between the first and third game, which they at least got that right, which is why I'm giving the rating it gets. Another thing I don't really get with William is how he already has scars from the Springlock suit, and he's not Springtrap yet. Doesn't really make sense. Which, I don't know, he gets Springtrap twice. I don't have long, but the ending is subpar at best. It leaves you wondering what's this about a crow, and I don't really get it. Charlie's father, he was mentioned to have died from a suit coming from her dream, which was done very poorly, which is why I'm giving it 1 Fazbear out of 10. Well, it seems as my time is up. I don't know how much longer I have. It's been nice.